They actually raised their glasses and wished me well on my last year alive. They thought it was funny, a kind of clever cruelty wrapped in a toast. But the truth is, I felt the words fall over me like a blanket soaked in ice water, a reminder that I was no longer seen as a woman sitting at the head of her own table, but as a ticking clock they had already begun counting down. I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I did not let my hand tremble when I lifted my own glass. But I felt a silence settle inside me that no laughter in that room could cover. I am 82 years old now, though the number feels both absurdly heavy and strangely distant, like an outfit someone has thrown across my shoulders that does not fit, but is expected to be worn. I live above a laundromat on the quiet edge of a neighborhood that used to hum with factory noise, but now is softened by the constant cycle of washing machines. At night, I fall asleep to the sound of water rushing and spinning, and sometimes I think it is more comforting than any lullaby I ever sang to my children. It was not always like this. I once lived in a large house with a garden that I kept neat with the stubborn pride of someone who knew every flower by name and watered each of them as if they were fragile secrets. But that house is no longer mine, not in spirit anyway, and I find myself sitting in a small flat with 2 chairs, a kettle, and a window that faces east. I tell myself that this is freedom, that the simplicity is a choice. But the truth is that it is also the result of decades of erasure, the slow stripping away of my place in a family that once could not have existed without me. The birthday dinner was supposed to be a celebration. They told me it would be special, that I should dress nicely, and that everyone would be there. They booked a long table in the back of an Italian restaurant, one of those glossy places with polished wooden floors and waiters who speak to you as though you might break if their voice rises too sharply. My daughter-in-law Lisa insisted on black balloons, not the golden kind you usually see at birthdays, but black, as though the joke of mortality had to be made visible. The cake had white frosting and red letters that read, "1 foot in the grave, 1 hand on the wine." Everyone clapped when they brought it out, even the children, though I do not think they understood. I smiled too, because it is easier to smile than to explain to people who already think you are past explanation. It was my birthday, yet I sat in that chair feeling like the entertainment, the act of the evening, something to mock gently before moving on to the real conversations about property prices, job promotions, the children's schools. I tried to catch my son's eye, Daniel's, but he never really looked at me, not directly. He raised his glass when he made the toast, but his eyes were fixed somewhere just above my head, as though meeting my gaze would risk revealing the truth of what he felt. The truth I knew was simple. They had already decided I was fading, irrelevant, a burden that needed managing more than loving. I wore a navy dress, the same one I had worn at Daniel's wedding 27 years ago, though no one noticed. I wore it because it was one of the last pieces of clothing that still made me feel like myself, like the woman who once danced until her heels cracked and her hair came loose. When the laughter filled the room after that cruel toast, I pressed my hand against the fabric of my dress under the table, as if to remind myself that I was still here, still present in my own skin, even if they preferred to pretend otherwise. The room was full, and yet I had never felt so painfully singular, so erased within the noise of people who bore my name. The candles on the cake flickered as the children leaned forward to blow them out before I had the chance. Another small theft disguised as play, and the waiters cleared the plates before I had even finished eating. Nothing that night belonged to me, not even the minutes. I remember looking at the clock above the bar and realizing I was measuring the time not until the evening ended, but until I could finally be alone again. The truth is, I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of vanishing before death even arrives, of being treated as if I have already been folded away into silence. They do not see me anymore, not the way I see myself when I look in the mirror and recognize the curve of my cheekbones from when I was 25, the persistence in my eyes that carried me through nights of hunger, bills, and heartbreak. To them, I am a figure at the end of the table, a photograph already fading, a signature on papers they are waiting for me to sign. But I am more than that, and if they had listened, even for a moment, they would have heard the secret I carried quietly inside me that night, the one that sat heavier in my chest than their laughter ever could. I did not reveal it then, not yet. But as I sat there watching them eat and talk and drink, I realized that the joke they made about my last year alive was more prophetic than they knew, because it truly was the last year I would live as the quiet, compliant, invisible mother and grandmother they assumed I had become. That night was not only a birthday, it was a funeral of the silence I had carried for too long, and though no one noticed, I lit the first candle of my own survival when I blew out the smoke of their cruel laughter and let it vanish into the air. The moment of betrayal did not arrive with thunder or a raised voice. It arrived quietly, dressed in the polite language of efficiency, cloaked in the smiles of people who were already looking past me. And for that reason, it cut deeper than any open cruelty could have. A week after the dinner, when the echoes of laughter about my last year alive still stung like a bruise under the skin, Daniel came to my apartment with a leather folder tucked under his arm, and Lisa trailing behind him with her smile sharpened into the kind of sweetness that always means danger. They sat at my small kitchen table, the one pressed against the wall beneath the only painting I kept from the old house, and without even pretending to make conversation, Daniel slid the folder toward me as if it were nothing more than another birthday card I should be expected to receive without protest. He spoke in that careful voice he uses when he thinks he is being rational, but the words themselves felt like erasures. "It's just some paperwork, Mom. Things to help us simplify matters when the time comes. Nothing to worry about. Nothing dramatic." Lisa leaned in, resting her manicured hand lightly on the folder as though she were introducing me to a new recipe, saying, "It's standard. Everyone does this. It just makes transitions smoother." But what they meant, and what I felt with every cell in my body, was that they wanted my signature now, before my mind was deemed too soft, before I might resist, before I could decide for myself where my life and the things I had worked for should go. They spoke about safety, about ease, about protecting me from stress. But there was no question in their voices, no genuine concern, only an assumption that my answer would be yes, as it always had been, for decades when they needed money, when they needed childcare, when they needed me to stay late or cook more or forgive faster than was fair. For years I had signed checks, papers, excuses, always quietly, because that was what love seemed to require. But as I looked down at the folder, thick with documents and heavy with words I was not supposed to read, I felt the sharp recognition that this was not love. This was the removal of my very presence from the narrative of my own life. I opened the folder slowly, though my hands wanted to push it away. and saw the pages inside were dense with legal phrasing, phrases like transfer of ownership and designation of executor and living trust. My name was there, printed clearly in bold letters, followed by empty lines waiting for my signature, waiting for my surrender. I could almost hear the echo of their toast. May this be your last year alive, reverberating in those lines. Because here was the proof that they were not waiting for life to run its course naturally. They were staging it, arranging it, packaging it neatly in binders and contracts, as though I were an item of property that needed cataloging. Lisa poured tea as though nothing monumental was happening, asking if I wanted honey, and Daniel explained the benefits in the same tone he once used to ask me for the keys to the car when he was 17. But underneath it all was the thrum of urgency, the desperation of people who did not want to wait for time to do its work. I nodded politely, as I always do, but inside I felt something cold and sharp uncoil, the awareness that they had not gathered to protect me but to erase me in advance, to make sure that when the day came, there would be nothing left to decide, nothing left to argue, nothing left of me. I asked Daniel why the rush, why now, why this sudden urgency to arrange what could be arranged later. He smiled without meeting my eyes and said, "It's just practical, Mom. You know how the world is. It avoids confusion." But confusion for whom? Not for me. I knew what I wanted, I knew what I had, and I knew the worth of my own decisions. The confusion they feared was their own, the possibility that I might not do what they assumed, that I might not hand over everything with the same obedience that had defined my motherhood. Lisa chimed in with her soft voice, telling me that the kids will feel more secure if everything is organized now, as though the grandchildren's security depended on the premature signing away of their grandmother's autonomy. The insult lay not just in the request, but in the expectation, the casual certainty that I would comply. Because hadn't I always? Hadn't I always been the one to clean up, to sign off, to nod and smile and swallow my anger? They thought this would be no different. They did not see the way my hand, resting on the tablecloth, clenched into a fist under the cover of my napkin. They did not hear the silent vow I made as they spoke, that this time I would not surrender. This time I would not play along. The betrayal was not loud, but it was absolute. It was the betrayal of being reduced to a legal process, the betrayal of realizing that my life had been translated into assets and liabilities, into rooms and furniture and numbers and accounts, all of which they believed could be theirs with one pen stroke. It was not about greed alone, though greed was there, glittering in Lisa's quick glance at Daniel as I flipped through the pages. It was about control, about ensuring that my story ended on their terms, not mine. When they left that afternoon, folders still unopened on the table because I had told them I would think about it. Lisa kissed my cheek with lips as cold as marble, and Daniel squeezed my shoulder as though he had already won. I closed the door behind them, locked it, and stood in the kitchen staring at that folder until the sun slid across the floor and turned the room gold. And I understood in a way that was irreversible that their toast had not been a careless joke. It had been a rehearsal, a signal of what was to come, a performance of the truth they were too polite to say outright, that in their eyes I was already gone, already folded into memory, already diminished to a set of papers waiting for signatures. That moment, quiet as it was, became the fire under my ribs, the catalyst that shifted everything, because I saw finally that the greatest danger was not death itself, but the living death of being treated as though I no longer had the right to my own story. The week after that conversation with Daniel and Lisa stretched out like a long corridor with no windows, every step echoing with the sound of that folder lying unopened on my kitchen table. A silent intruder that carried their intentions more clearly than any words could. I did not sign it, of course, but I also did not throw it away. Not immediately, because part of me still believed that if I looked at those pages again, I might discover I had imagined the coldness in their voices, that perhaps they really were motivated by concern, by practicality, by something less corrosive than the hunger for control. But each day that passed, as I brewed my morning coffee and saw the edge of that folder peeking out from under a stack of magazines, I felt the truth settle deeper into me, the undeniable awareness that I had ceased to be their mother and had become instead a problem to be solved, a variable to be managed, a line item in the balance sheet of their carefully curated lives. It was not the request alone that hurt me, but the indifference in their eyes when they made it, the absence of any recognition of what it meant to me to be asked to surrender not only my belongings, but my authority, my voice, my right to shape my own ending. That absence lingered longer than the words themselves, and it began to seep into everything, like damp creeping up a wall until even the air smells of rot. I noticed the change in small ways first, in the way phone calls from Daniel became shorter, as though every minute he gave me was borrowed from something more important, in the way Lisa's voice on the answering machine carried the clipped brightness of someone performing kindness without believing in it. Even the grandchildren, once quick to call me for stories or homework help, now sent messages only when prompted, each one brief, polite, and hollow. I was still included in family gatherings, still invited to Sunday lunches, but I began to see the invitations differently, no longer as gestures of love, but as acts of obligation, like setting a place for an old heirloom at the table so no one can say it was forgotten, even if no one actually uses it. At those lunches, I found myself surrounded by conversations I could not enter, discussions of mortgages and promotions and vacation plans. And when I tried to contribute, when I mentioned a book I had read or a memory that felt relevant, the air seemed to close over my words like water swallowing a stone, leaving no ripple. They did not argue with me. They did not correct me. They simply moved on. And that silence was sharper than any open dismissal. It was the silence of being unseen, and once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. Lisa began to stop by unannounced, under the pretense of helping, though her visits always left me feeling smaller rather than supported. She would open cupboards and comment on how much expired food I had, though it was not expired, only dated with numbers she pretended not to understand. She would run a finger along the shelf and sigh at the dust, though I cleaned every week. She would suggest little changes, a grab bar in the bathroom, a simpler phone, a pill organizer, each suggestion made in the tone of someone speaking to a child, each one reminding me that in her eyes, I was no longer capable of caring for myself. I knew these were rehearsals, small rehearsals for the larger performance they expected of me. The moment when I would surrender the folder, when I would hand over the house, the savings, the scraps of independence I still guarded. Their cruelty was never loud, but it grew, layering itself in daily interactions until I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, tolerated but not embraced, present but not valued. The hardest moment came one afternoon when my grandson, the one I believed still saw me as more than an obligation, sat at my table eating the cookies I had baked, the same recipe he used to beg for as a boy, and he said almost casually, "Dad says once everything's sorted, it'll be easier for everyone, even you, Grandma." He did not mean to wound me. He said it with the innocent logic of someone repeating what he had heard. But the words pierced me because they revealed how deeply this narrative had seeped into the family, how natural it had become for them to think of my life as a matter of paperwork and transition, rather than a story still being written. I smiled and offered him another cookie. But inside, I felt the fracture widen, the recognition that even the ones I thought of as mine, the ones I had poured myself into, were being reshaped by the hunger of others. That night, when the apartment was quiet and the street below hummed with the ordinary noise of strangers living their own uncurated lives, I sat at the window and realized that my world was shrinking, not because of age, not because of time, but because the people closest to me were pushing against its edges, squeezing me into a smaller and smaller corner, until one day, if I allowed it, there would be no room left at all. The first escalation was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no slammed doors. It was subtler, crueler, a series of erasures so gentle that someone less alert might not even notice. But I noticed, and once I did, I could not unsee how deliberate it all was. Every sigh from Lisa, every distracted nod from Daniel, every polite but distant message from the grandchildren, it all formed a pattern, a quiet campaign to convince me that I was already obsolete, that my best choice was to comply, to make it easier for them by disappearing before I had even left this world. And in that recognition, something in me began to shift. I did not know yet what I would do, but I knew I could not remain as I was, waiting for the walls to close completely. The silence they offered me was meant to diminish, but it began instead to ignite. And though I said nothing aloud, though I nodded and smiled and let them believe I was still pliant, inside, I had begun to prepare, not for death, but for the refusal to die on their terms. It is strange how a decision can begin not with a shout or a declaration, but with the quietest of gestures, the simple act of standing in front of a mirror and refusing to look away. That was how it began for me, not with the folder of documents, not with Daniel's careful explanations or Lisa's syrupy insistence, but with my own face reflected in the bathroom mirror one ordinary morning when the sun was falling across the tiles in a line of pale gold. I looked at myself longer than I usually do, longer than the quick glances I had grown used to taking, as if even my own reflection were something to be managed and avoided. And I saw not just the creases at the corners of my mouth or the gray woven through my hair, but the stubborn brightness in my eyes that had carried me through every year that had tried to erase me. It was as if I was meeting myself again, not the mother they had trained me to be, not the grandmother who baked and babysat and signed whatever papers were put in front of her, but the woman who once left her parents' house at 19 with nothing but a small suitcase and a refusal to marry the man they had chosen for her. That woman was still there, hidden under layers of compliance, waiting for me to remember her. And in that moment, I knew that the silence they were asking me to accept was not inevitable. It could be broken. It had to be broken. The shift did not happen with fireworks or drama. It unfolded in small acts of resistance that felt almost ordinary, but each one was a thread pulling me away from the net they had thrown over me. I began by making a phone call, not to Daniel or Lisa, but to a lawyer whose number I had written down months earlier from a bench advertisement I passed on my way to the pharmacy. The woman's voice was steady, brisk, practical, And when I told her about the folder, she did not sound surprised. She said, "You still have every right to decide, and if you want to protect that, there are ways." The phrase, "every right," struck me like a bell ringing in a quiet church. It had been so long since anyone had reminded me that my rights did not disappear with my wrinkles, that my voice was not erased by my age. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday, and when I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes not from solving a problem, but from finally admitting that you are willing to face it. In the days that followed, I began to take other small steps. I walked through the neighborhood more often, slower than I once did, but with purpose, as if mapping out a terrain that still belonged to me. I bought myself a notebook, a simple spiral-bound one from the corner shop, and I began writing down things I remembered, things I wanted, things I feared, not because anyone else would read them, but because I needed to remind myself that my thoughts still had weight. I sorted through my drawers and pulled out old bank statements, pension papers, the stock certificates my late husband had left me, things I had barely looked at in years because Daniel always offered to keep them safe. For the first time in decades, I spread them across my own table and read every line. It was exhausting, yes, but also electrifying, as if I had unearthed a map of myself that I had forgotten existed. I knew I could not confront them yet, not without preparation, not without certainty. So I played the role they expected of me, attending Sunday lunches, smiling at the children, listening to Lisa's carefully constructed complaints about the price of groceries and the stress of private school applications, nodding while Daniel spoke about his latest project at work. I played my part, but under the table, my hand would brush the edge of my purse, where my notebook now lived, filled with notes, questions, reminders of who I was and what I had. They thought I was passive, but inside I was sharpening. The most significant moment came at the lawyer's office. I sat across from a woman younger than Daniel, with a sharp suit and a sharper mind, and I handed her the folder they had given me. She read it quickly, her eyes narrowing in the places where the language twisted obligation into care, where generosity was disguised as necessity. She looked up at me and said, "They are trying to secure everything now, before you realize you have other options." I felt heat rise in my chest, not from shock, I already knew it, but from the affirmation, the external proof that I was not imagining it, not being paranoid, not ungrateful. She explained what I could do. Change my will, set conditions, protect my accounts, even appoint someone else as executor entirely. I listened, nodded, and signed nothing that day, because I wanted time. But as I left her office, I carried with me the knowledge that I was not powerless, that the very thing they wanted to strip from me could still be mine if I chose it. That night, I brewed tea and sat by the window as the city lights flickered, and I realized something had shifted irreversibly. It was not only about the money, or the house, or the papers. It was about reclaiming the simple truth that my life was still mine, that the years ahead, whether few or many, could be shaped by my own hand. The silence that had grown inside me after the birthday toast had cracked, and through that crack, light was seeping in. I had not yet spoken aloud the secret I carried, the one that would change everything when I finally revealed it. But I no longer felt suffocated by the weight of their expectations. I felt, for the first time in years, the quiet pulse of possibility. It was only the beginning, and I knew the escalation would come, that they would press harder, that they would sense the resistance in me and respond with pressure. But at the midpoint of my story, in that soft Tuesday evening, with the taste of tea on my tongue and the notebook heavy in my lap, I allowed myself to believe something I had not dared to in a long time, that my story was not over, and that perhaps, just perhaps, it had only just begun again. The quiet resistance I had begun to cultivate, the secret visits to the lawyer, and the silent accumulation of my own documents, could only remain hidden for so long before the pressure from the other side began to thicken like storm clouds over a summer field. And sure enough it came, not in one sudden bolt of lightning, but in the slow, deliberate tightening of their grip, each gesture more insistent, each word more calculated, as though they could smell the change in me and feared that their control was slipping away. It began with phone calls, Daniel's voice sharpened by a forced calm that never fooled me, telling me he was worried, telling me that I seemed distracted lately, that I had been distant, asking if I was forgetting things, if I was keeping up with my medications, his words laced with the kind of concern that is less about the person being addressed and more about the record that might later be kept. Lisa left messages on my machine that dripped with sweetness, repeating over and over that they just wanted what was best for me, that they did not want me to feel burdened, that they only wanted to make things easier. Yet her tone was the same one she used when she spoke to the children about chores, the tone of someone who is not asking but commanding under the cover of kindness. When I did not respond quickly enough, the visits resumed, unannounced and uninvited. Lisa arriving at my door with a casserole dish in her hands, smiling as though she were doing me some noble favor, her eyes scanning the apartment, not for dust or disorder, but for signs of weakness. She commented on how tired I looked, how thin I seemed, how it might be time to think about next steps, her words fluttering innocently but carrying the weight of steel. She made suggestions about assisted living, about safety, about how lonely it must be here. Above the laundromat, as though she were offering me companionship rather than imprisonment. Daniel came too, pacing my small living room as though he owned it, speaking of practicalities, of how the market was strong right now, how it might be wise to sell the house before values shifted, his sentences built like traps that left no room for refusal without sounding irrational. I listened. I nodded. I smiled. But inside me the vow grew harder, sharper, because with every word they spoke, they confirmed what I had begun to understand, that they were not protecting me. They were dismantling me, one visit at a time, one conversation at a time, eroding my claim to myself by insisting they were only helping. The real escalation came when the first letter arrived, not from them, but from a lawyer they had hired on their own. The envelope was thick, the kind that feels heavier than it should, and when I opened it, the language inside was precise and chilling. It spoke of ensuring the ongoing welfare of Mrs. Harlow, of protecting her assets from mismanagement, of establishing a secure environment for her remaining years. There it was again, the echo of that birthday toast disguised in legal vocabulary. Remaining years, as though I were a bank account slowly being depleted, as though my worth had already been counted and catalogued. The letter requested that I consider signing over power of attorney to prevent unnecessary complications, and it bore both Daniel's and Lisa's signatures at the bottom, as though their unity could outweigh my own will. I sat with the paper in my lap, reading and rereading those phrases, feeling the heat rise in my chest, not from confusion, but from clarity, because now it was written in black and white what they had been saying in softer tones for months. They were no longer simply hoping for my compliance. They were demanding it, formalizing it, pushing me into a corner from which they believed I could not escape. But what they did not know was that I had already begun to move, already taken steps they could not imagine. I called my own lawyer, the woman with the sharp eyes and the sharper suit, and I handed her their letter. She smiled, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of someone who knows the battlefield is finally being revealed, and she said, "Good. Now we know what they want. Now we can decide what you want." We drafted documents of my own, not to mirror theirs, but to protect against them. A will that placed my assets in trust for purposes I would decide. An executor who was not a member of my family, but a professional bound by law, and a stipulation that no changes could be made without my explicit written and notarized consent. I walked out of her office with copies in my bag, heavy but reassuring, and for the first time in years I felt that I had armor. The escalation, of course, was not only legal but emotional. They began to press harder at gatherings, slipping in comments that seemed light but cut deeply. At one dinner, Daniel raised his glass again and said, "Here's to Mom, still hanging in there, sharper than ever." The words ringing false as coins dropped on stone, his smile tight, his eyes glancing quickly at Lisa. The grandchildren whispered questions about inheritance they did not understand, questions that could only have been seeded by adult mouths. One of them, my eldest grandson, asked me point blank if I had signed the papers yet, as if it were an errand no different from mailing a letter. And when I laughed lightly to deflect, his face clouded with the confusion of a child who has been told something is certain and now finds it is not. That was the moment I realized that the story of my supposed decline, my supposed incompetence, was not only being told behind my back, but was being woven into the family narrative, passed down like a script for them all to rehearse. They were preparing everyone for my absence, not after death, but now, while I still lived. One afternoon, Lisa arrived with photographs of a retirement community, glossy images of smiling elderly couples playing cards, swimming, sitting in perfectly manicured gardens, and she spread them across my table as if they were invitations to paradise. She spoke of safety, of medical staff, of companionship, but all I saw were locked doors, schedules I had not chosen, a place designed to soften the edges of decline until the person inside no longer recognized herself. I listened politely, asked questions she thought were genuine, and when she finally packed up her brochures with a satisfied sigh, I felt the line harden inside me. I would never go. Not because I feared the place, but because I feared the surrender, the quiet resignation of stepping into a life designed by others, a life stripped of sharpness, of decision, of ownership. The escalation tested me in ways I had not expected. There were nights I lay awake listening to the washing machines below, their endless spin echoing in my chest, and wondered if I had the strength to continue resisting, if it would not be easier to sign, to surrender, to let the current carry me where they wanted. But then I would remember the look in Daniel's eyes when he spoke of the house as though it were already his, the way Lisa's hand lingered possessively on the folder, the way my grandson's innocent voice repeated their lines, and I knew that to surrender would not be easier. It would be annihilation. I wrote letters in my notebook, not to them, but to myself, reminders of what I had endured, of the nights I stayed awake rocking sick children, of the years I worked double shifts to pay for their schooling. of the countless times I chose silence to keep the peace. I reminded myself that I had already lived a life of sacrifice, and that now, whatever years remained, I was allowed to live a life of refusal. The escalation came to a head when Lisa arrived, not with photographs or casseroles, but with tears. She sat at my table, her voice trembling, saying she was scared, that she could not sleep worrying about me, that she did not want to see me decline without support. Her performance so convincing that for a moment even I almost believed her. But then I remembered the lawyer's letter with her signature on it, and I saw the calculation behind her tears, the performance designed to guilt me into surrender. I poured her tea. I held her hand. I told her I understood. And when she left, I locked the door and laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of the recognition that the roles had shifted. They thought they were escalating their pressure, but in truth they were revealing themselves, showing me exactly how far they were willing to go, and in that revelation I found not fear, but strength. The storm had thickened. The air was heavy, the pressure nearly unbearable, but beneath it all, I felt the first true spark of defiance, the understanding that escalation works both ways, and that while they pressed harder from the outside, I was hardening on the inside, preparing not merely to resist, but to act. The second escalation was their attempt to break me, but it became instead the sharpening of my resolve, the moment when I ceased to be merely a mother clinging to dignity and became a woman preparing for her own survival, her own reclamation, her own irreversible decision. The moment of climax in a life rarely arrives with a drum roll or the neat symmetry of a novel. It arrives quietly, after months or even years of pressure, and then suddenly it tips. Suddenly, the balance that has been leaning against you for so long shifts under your hand, and you realize you are not the one being toppled. You are the one pushing back. And that is what happened to me. Not on a grand stage and not with raised voices, but in the stillness of my own decision that I would no longer be erased. The escalation of their pressure had reached its peak. The letters, the visits, the tearful performances, the endless insinuations that I was too tired, too fragile, too confused to be trusted. And then, one morning, I woke up and felt none of the fear they had tried to plant in me, only a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, and I knew that the time for silence was over. I brewed my tea, dressed in my navy dress, the one they never noticed, but which had become my armor, and I gathered the papers from my lawyer, the copies that bore my new decisions, my new signatures, my new authority, and I placed them in my bag. That bag had carried groceries, school forms, and birthday cards for decades, but that day, it carried my reclamation, and I walked out of my apartment with a straight back and a steadiness in my step that I had not felt in years. The confrontation came not in a courtroom, though that would come later, but at the Sunday lunch where they expected me, the ritual gathering where my presence was tolerated more than welcomed, where the conversations flowed over me as though I were a piece of furniture at the edge of the room. I arrived on time, placed my bag carefully beside my chair, and I let them go through the motions. Lisa bustling with her dishes, Daniel pouring wine, the grandchildren half present in their devices, and I let them speak of mortgages and vacations, of school fees and renovations, until Daniel finally turned to me with that practiced smile and said, "Mom, we really should talk about the papers. It's time to make things official." I felt the hush under his words, the anticipation in Lisa's watchful eyes, the expectation that I would finally yield, that the campaign they had waged with such persistence would bear fruit. But instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder that was not theirs, but mine. I laid it on the table slowly, deliberately, and said, "Yes, it is time, but not for what you think." They blinked, their rehearsed lines crumbling in the air, and I opened the folder to reveal the documents prepared with my lawyer, the updated will, the trust arrangements, the appointment of a professional executor, and the clear, unequivocal removal of their authority over me. I spoke in a calm voice, the kind I had used when teaching Daniel to ride a bike, steady and unyielding, and I said, "I have taken care of my affairs. Everything is arranged, everything is protected, and none of it requires your signatures, your oversight, or your approval." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter at that cursed birthday toast. It was the silence of people caught in their own reflection, and I did not flinch when Daniel's face hardened or when Lisa's lips tightened into that smile she wears when she is calculating her next move. I continued, because once the words began, they could not be stopped. I told them I knew what they had tried to do. I told them I recognized the pressure, the manipulation, the rewriting of my life into a set of assets, and I told them that I was not angry, not anymore, because anger would mean I still needed their acknowledgement, and I no longer did. What I felt was clarity, and clarity was enough. Lisa tried to protest, her voice trembling with outrage disguised as hurt, insisting that they only wanted to protect me, that they had been worried, that I was twisting their intentions. But I cut her off with a firmness she had never heard from me before, saying, "Protection does not require power, and love does not demand signatures." Daniel's jaw clenched. He muttered about practicality, about responsibility, about how I was making things difficult. But I leaned forward, met his eyes for the first time in years, and said, "Difficult for whom? For me? Or for you who counted on me disappearing quietly?" His silence was the answer, and I knew then that there was no turning back, no softening of this act. The confrontation was not about winning an argument. It was about taking back the ground under my feet, about showing them that I had not already vanished, that I was still here, still capable, still sovereign. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply spoke. And in that steadiness lay the greatest power I had ever felt. I told them that I had sold the house, not to them, not to anyone in the family, but to a buyer who had no connection to us, and that the proceeds were already secured in accounts they could not touch. I told them that my assets were now protected in ways they could not unravel, that my decisions were recorded legally, witnessed, notarized, and that no letter, no visit, no tearful plea could undo them. I told them that if they loved me, truly loved me, then they would learn to love me without the expectation of inheritance, without the illusion of ownership, without the leash of dependence. And then, in the final act of that moment, I told them the secret I had held back, the one that had sat like a stone in my chest since the birthday toast, that I had already chosen where my legacy would go, and it was not to them as they had imagined, but to causes and people who still understood what dignity meant, to organizations that cared for women who had been silenced, to scholarships for young girls who had no one to stand behind them, to the grandson who still looked at me with eyes that had not yet learned to diminish. The table was silent, the food untouched, the children wide-eyed, and I felt the air clear around me as though the truth itself had opened a window. They did not applaud. They did not thank me, but they understood, and that was enough. The climax of my story was not the destruction of our bond, but the liberation of myself from it, the irreversible step away from their control. And as I gathered my folder, stood, and walked out of that house, I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel victorious. I felt free. And freedom, after so many years of quiet erasure, was louder than any applause. When the storm has passed, what remains is not silence, but a different kind of stillness. One that is not imposed from the outside, but chosen from within. And that is what I live in now. Not the suffocating quiet of being ignored at my own birthday table, not the hollow space of being talked over at family dinners, but the steady, calm quiet of a woman who has claimed her own life back after years of watching it slip into other hands. After the confrontation, after laying the papers on the table and speaking words I had never dared to speak, I did not feel the need to argue further. I did not feel the need to justify or soften what I had done. I felt instead an immense relief, the kind that seeps into your bones and reminds you that you have survived the worst and that survival itself is enough. I moved into a smaller flat, a place that belongs entirely to me, not in the way of deeds and signatures, though those are mine too, but in spirit, in the way sunlight moves across the walls in the morning and the way the river's reflection shimmers in the window at night. I bought a chair that fits me perfectly. I stocked the cupboards with food I actually enjoy. I allowed myself small luxuries like flowers every week. Things that once I would have called indulgences, but now I recognize as simple acknowledgments that my life is worth beauty, even without an audience. I wake early, I make tea, I write in the notebook that has become my companion, and I watch the sun rise as if it were a gift handed directly to me. For the first time in many years, I feel the texture of my own days, not as something I must get through for the sake of others, but as something I get to live because I am still here. Daniel does not call often anymore, and when he does, the conversations are clipped, careful, as though he is afraid I will remind him of what he lost when he failed to see me as more than a set of signatures. Lisa has stopped visiting entirely, her absence a kind of unspoken punishment. But I do not feel punished. I feel released. The grandchildren sometimes reach out, sometimes they do not. But when they do, I no longer scramble to make myself available. I listen, I respond, and I let the rest go. Relationships do not vanish overnight, but they change, and I have accepted that ours have shifted into something new, something less consuming, and in that acceptance, I have found peace. The greatest change, though, is not in them, but in me. I carry myself differently now, even in the smallest errands, even when I am only buying bread or standing at the bus stop, because I know that I am no longer living as an afterthought. I find myself speaking to strangers more often, lingering in conversations, laughing more freely, not because I am trying to replace what was lost, but because I no longer fear being unseen. I have friends now, not many, but enough. A retired nurse from down the hall, the girl at the pharmacy who always asks about my week, women from my bridge group who invite me for coffee. They see me, not as an obligation, not as a burden, but as someone present, someone whole. And I did not realize how deeply I had missed that until it returned. Sometimes, at night, I write letters to myself. Small notes that begin with, "You did it," or "You are here," or "You matter." And I tuck them between the pages of my notebook, not because I fear forgetting, but because I want to create a record, a trail of reminders for the days when doubt creeps back in. I remind myself that survival is not just continuing to breathe, but choosing to live in ways that affirm your own worth. And that is what I have done. The joke at my birthday, the toast to my last year alive, was meant to diminish me, but in truth it became the prophecy of something else. Because it was my last year alive in silence, my last year alive in compliance, my last year alive as the woman who allowed herself to be erased. Now, when I think of death, I do not fear it, because I know that I will not meet it already diminished. I will meet it as myself, whole, awake, unhidden. And if there is one message I would leave for any woman who might one day sit at her own table and feel herself becoming invisible, it is this: do not mistake their laughter for truth. Do not let their paperwork define your story. Do not believe that silence is the only path. You are more than their assumptions, more than their impatience, more than the years they count down in toasts. Speak, act, decide, even if your voice trembles, because the moment you do, you will remember that you were never gone. You were only waiting to rise.